The light fell through stained glass windows in shafts of amber and crimson, painting the ancient stone floor of St. Michael's Cathedral with fragments of color that trembled like living things. The scent of roses hung heavy in the air, cloying and sweet, mingling with the incense that rose in pale wisps from the altar where Lady Arabella Thornton stood in her wedding gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, her hands clasped so tightly around the bouquet of white roses that the stems bit into her palms through her gloves. 300 members of the nobility sat in the pews behind her, their collective breath held in anticipation of the vows that would unite the ancient Thornton line with the formidable house of Ashworth, and the silence was so profound that Arabella could hear the rapid flutter of her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel each pulse of blood through her constricted throat. She had told herself 1,000 times in the weeks leading to this moment that the arrangement was a sensible one, that the Duke of Ashworth was by all accounts a suitable match, that her father had only her best interests at heart when he'd negotiated the marriage contract. She had told herself that the whispers she'd heard about Sebastian Ashworth, the stories of his coldness, his ruthlessness in business, the mysterious dissolution of his first betrothal, were merely the jealous gossip of those who envied his wealth and title. She had told herself these things, and yet as she stood before him now, as she forced herself to raise her eyes to meet his gaze, she felt something cold and terrible unfurl in her chest like a flower of ice. His eyes were grey, the color of winter storms, and they looked at her with an expression she could not decipher, something that might have been anticipation or calculation, or perhaps nothing at all, a perfect, terrible blankness that suggested she was not a woman about to become his wife, but rather a piece of property being catalogued and assessed. His face was handsome, aristocratic, all sharp angles and patrician features, but it was frozen in an expression of such absolute control that it seemed carved from marble rather than flesh. The priest's voice droned on in Latin, words that should have been sacred and beautiful but which sounded to Arabella's ears like the tolling of a funeral bell. She looked at Sebastian's hands, strong and elegant, and imagined them reaching for her in anger, in possession, in whatever dark impulses lurked behind that impenetrable facade. She thought of her mother, dead these 5 years, and wondered what counsel she might have given, what comfort she might have offered. She thought of the life stretching before her, decades bound to this stranger, who looked at her as though she were a ledger to be balanced or a problem to be solved. The roses in her hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, weighted with all the futures she was surrendering, all the choices being made for her rather than by her. Her breath came faster, shorter, her vision narrowing to a tunnel that contained only those grey eyes, and the terrible certainty blooming in her heart that if she spoke the vows the priest was preparing to demand of her, she would be lost forever to something she could not name, but which terrified her to her very soul. The bouquet slipped from her fingers, white roses scattering across the stone floor with a sound like rain, and then she was running, her silk skirts gathered in trembling hands, her footsteps echoing through the nave in a rhythm that matched her racing heart as she fled down the aisle, past the shocked faces of the assembled nobility, past her father's cry of dismay, past everything she had been taught about duty and obedience and the proper behavior of a lady. Behind her, still standing at the altar, Sebastian Ashworth did not move, did not call out, did not follow. His face remained frozen in that same terrible expression, but his hand, his left hand, hanging at his side, slowly curled into a fist so tight that his knuckles went white, and in the silence that followed Arabella's departure, the whispers began like a rising tide, filling the cathedral with speculation and scandal that would echo through London's drawing rooms for years to come. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. 3 years had passed since that day in St. Michael's Cathedral, 3 years in which the scandal of Lady Arabella Thornton's flight from the altar had gradually faded from the forefront of London's gossip to become merely another cautionary tale whispered over tea, and in those years Arabella had found something she had never expected to possess: peace. Thornbury Manor sat nestled in the gentle hills of Derbyshire, a modest estate by aristocratic standards, consisting of a manor house of warm, honey-coloured stone that had been built 2 centuries prior, 40 acres of land, including gardens that Arabella had restored with her own hands, and a small home farm that provided enough income to sustain her simple life. The house itself was comfortable rather than grand, with low ceilings crossed by dark beams, windows that looked out over rolling meadows where sheep grazed in contentment, and rooms that had grown familiar and beloved through daily use, rather than remaining the unused showpieces of grander estates. Here, in this quiet corner of England, far from the drawing rooms and ballrooms, where her name was still occasionally mentioned with disapproval, Arabella had built a life that felt authentically her own. She rose with the sun most mornings and walked through her gardens, tending to the roses she had planted in the first months after her arrival, the lavender that filled the air with its calming scent, the kitchen herbs that she supplied to the village. She painted watercolors of the countryside, modest works that would never hang in galleries, but which captured the play of light across the hills in ways that pleased her. She read voraciously, building a library from the books she purchased on her infrequent trips to the market town, works of poetry and philosophy, and novels that transported her to worlds beyond her own. The villagers of Thornbury, initially uncertain of the scandalous lady who had come to live among them, had gradually warmed to her. Through her genuine kindness and her charitable works, she had established a small school for the tenant children, contributed to the church's fund for the poor, visited the sick with baskets of provisions from her own kitchens. Mrs. Davies, her housekeeper, had become something more than a servant, a companion who understood Arabella's need for quiet and her occasional melancholy without needing explanation. The shame of what she had done still lived within Arabella's heart, a constant weight that pressed against her chest in the small hours of the night when sleep would not come. The knowledge that she had humiliated a man before 300 witnesses, had broken a sacred promise, had behaved in a manner utterly contrary to everything she had been taught about duty and honor. And yet, when she was honest with herself in those same dark hours, she felt also a profound relief that she had trusted her instincts and that she had escaped what she still believed would have been a terrible fate: marriage to a man whose cold eyes had promised nothing but misery, whose reputation spoke of cruelty and calculation, who would have possessed her utterly under the laws that gave husbands such absolute power over their wives. The spring rain fell gently on Thornbury Manor on the morning the letter arrived, and soft drops that made the new growth in the gardens glisten and brought the scent of wet earth through the open windows of Arabella's sitting room, and she was reading Wordsworth by the fire when Mrs. Davies entered with the post, among which was a letter from Mr. Pemberton, her solicitor in the nearby market town, requesting her presence for a matter of urgent importance regarding her estate. Mr. Pemberton's office occupied the upper floor of a narrow building on the high street of Ashbourne, the market town that served the surrounding countryside, and the stairs creaked ominously as Arabella climbed them 2 days after receiving his summons, her heart already beginning to beat with an anxiety she could not name but which had haunted her dreams the previous night. The solicitor's chambers were cramped and cluttered with the accumulated documents of decades of practice, shelves sagging under the weight of leather-bound ledgers and tied bundles of correspondence, and the small window overlooked the street where market-day crowds moved in colorful streams between the stalls. Mr. Pemberton himself was a slight man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose and a nervous habit of adjusting them that became more pronounced as he gestured for Arabella to sit in the chair facing his desk. She had known him since her arrival in Derbyshire, had trusted him to manage the legal affairs of her modest estate, and she had never before seen him display the kind of agitation that now manifested in his fidgeting hands and averted gaze. He began with pleasantries about the weather and her health, circling around the purpose of the meeting with an obvious reluctance that only heightened Arabella's apprehension, until finally she interrupted him with a directness that made him flinch and asked him plainly to tell her why he had summoned her. The words, when they came, seemed to cost him considerable effort, emerging in halting phrases as he explained that in the past month the 5 estates that bordered Thornbury Manor on all sides, Millbrook to the north, Riverside to the east, Hartley Park to the south, Westwind to the southwest, and Blackthorn Hall to the west, had all changed ownership, purchased through separate transactions by agents representing a single buyer whose identity had only recently been disclosed to the local land registry. Arabella felt the first stirrings of unease as she asked who this mysterious buyer might be. What person of means would have interest in acquiring such a comprehensive collection of properties in this quiet corner of Derbyshire? And she watched as Mr. Pemberton removed his spectacles, cleaned them unnecessarily with his handkerchief, replaced them, and finally met her eyes with an expression of profound discomfort as he spoke the name that made the blood drain from her face and her hands begin to tremble in her lap. The Duke of Ashworth. The room seemed to tilt and narrow, the sounds of the market below fading to a distant roar as fragments of memory assailed her Sebastian's grey eyes at the altar, cold and unreadable. The whispers she had heard about his ruthlessness in business dealings, his reputation for careful calculation and strategic maneuvering, the stories of those who had crossed him and found themselves methodically ruined through means that could never quite be proven, but which everyone suspected. Mr. Pemberton was speaking, his voice coming to her as if from a great distance, assuring her that it might well be mere coincidence, that a man of the Duke's wealth often acquired properties for investment purposes without particular design, that there was no reason to assume any malicious intent, but his eyes, his nervous, uncertain eyes that would not hold her gaze, betrayed the hollowness of his reassurances, revealed that he too suspected something more deliberate in this pattern of acquisition. Arabella managed to ask, though her voice sounded strange even to her own ears, whether the Duke had made any inquiries about Thornbury Manor itself, whether there had been any indication that he sought to purchase her property as well, and Mr. Pemberton shook his head but added that legally there was nothing preventing him from making an offer, should he choose to do so, though of course she would be under no obligation to accept. The meeting concluded in a blur of additional legal details that Arabella could barely process, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had learned, and she found herself walking back through the market streets toward where her small carriage waited without any clear memory of having descended the stairs or taken her leave of the solicitor. The journey back to Thornbury Manor passed in a haze of mounting dread as she looked at the familiar countryside with new eyes, understanding now that every neighboring property, every estate whose lands touched her own, belonged to the man she had fled from 3 years ago, the man she had humiliated before the entire aristocracy of England. As her carriage turned onto the lane that led to her home, she saw Thornbury Manor ahead, the honey-coloured stone that had seemed so warm and welcoming now appearing vulnerable and exposed, the gardens she had tended with such care suddenly feeling like the exercise yard of a prison, the peace she had built over 3 years revealed as an illusion that could be shattered at will by the man who now surrounded her on every side. The afternoon sun hung heavy in the western sky, 3 days after Arabella's meeting with Mr. Pemberton, casting long shadows across the gardens where she knelt among the roses, secateurs in hand, attempting to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of deadheading the spent blooms, and it was the sudden stillness of the bird song that made her look up, some instinct alert to a change in the atmosphere around her. At the far edge of her property, where the low stone wall marked the boundary between Thornbury Manor and what had been the Millbrook estate but was now his land, sat a figure on horseback, motionless against the backdrop of the late spring landscape, and even at such distance, perhaps 200 yards across the sloping meadow, she knew him with a certainty that made her breath catch in her throat. The Duke of Ashworth sat astride a dark bay hunter, his posture erect and formal even in this moment of stillness, and though she could not make out his features clearly, the shape of him, the way he held himself, the angle of his shoulders, all of it was burned into her memory from those terrible weeks before the wedding, when they had been forced together in drawing rooms and at dinners, going through the motions of a courtship that had been decided by their families before either of them had any real say. He did not call out to her, made no gesture of greeting or acknowledgement, simply sat there as though he had every right to observe her in her own garden, and the presumption of it, the silent claim it represented, sent a spike of fear through her chest, even as some other emotion she could not name twisted alongside it. Arabella found herself frozen in place, her hands still gripping the secateurs, rose petals scattered around her knees where she knelt in the soil, and for a long moment they remained thus, separated by distance and the accumulated weight of shame and scandal, two figures in a landscape that suddenly felt like a stage set for some drama whose ending she could not predict. Then, as abruptly as her paralysis had seized her, it broke, and she scrambled to her feet with none of the grace her governesses had spent years instilling, her gardening tools falling forgotten to the ground as she gathered her skirts and fled toward the house, her heart pounding with a violence that seemed excessive even as she could not slow her pace. She did not look back to see if he still watched. could not bear to know whether he remained or had ridden away, and it was only when she reached the safety of her sitting room and pressed herself against the wall beside the window, breathing hard, that she allowed herself to peer through the glass toward the boundary wall, only to find the distant figure gone as though he had been merely an apparition conjured by her guilty conscience. That night, sleep eluded her entirely, and she lay in her bed watching shadows move across the ceiling as the moon traversed the sky. Her mind churning through memories she had tried for 3 years to bury the way Sebastian had looked at her during their formal courtship calls, his grey eyes revealing nothing, while her father discussed settlements and her mother prattled about wedding arrangements, how he had seemed more statue than man, carved from marble and just as cold. She remembered the afternoon he had taken her walking in her family's London garden, how he had offered his arm with mechanical courtesy, had made appropriate comments about the weather and the flowers, had asked polite questions about her interests in painting and music, but through it all there had been such absence in his manner, such careful distance, that she had felt herself nothing more than an acquisition he was inspecting before purchase, a piece of property to be evaluated for its value to his estate and his lineage. There had been a moment, she recalled now in the darkness of her chamber, when he had paused beside the fountain and seemed about to speak something unscripted, something real, but then her mother had called from the terrace, and the moment had passed, his face closing like a door swinging shut, and whatever he might have said remained forever unspoken. The memory of the wedding day itself still had the power to make her stomach clench with shame and terror, intertwined standing in the vestibule of St. Michael's Cathedral in her white silk gown, the veil her grandmother had worn obscuring her vision like a shroud, listening to the organ music that signaled her entrance, knowing that in moments she would walk down that endless aisle toward a man she did not know, did not love, did not trust, and would bind herself to him in vows that could never be broken, giving him authority over her person, her property, her very existence, for as long as they both should live. She had looked at him standing at the altar, had seen the absolute stillness of his expression, the coldness in his eyes that might have been anything indifference, calculation, cruelty, but which had seemed in that moment like a preview of the life that awaited her, and something in her had simply broken, instinct overriding every lesson in duty and propriety, and she had dropped the bouquet of white roses and run. The letter arrived on the morning of the 4th day after Arabella had seen Sebastian at the boundary of her property, delivered by a liveried footman whose livery bore the Ashworth crest in silver thread against deep blue fabric, and Mrs. Davies brought it to her in the breakfast room, where Arabella sat pushing eggs around her plate without appetite, the housekeeper's expression carefully neutral as she placed the heavy cream envelope beside the teacup that had grown cold, while Arabella stared unseeing at the garden beyond the window. The paper was expensive, the kind used by the highest echelons of society, and Arabella's hands trembled slightly as she broke the ducal seal and unfolded the single sheet within, her eyes scanning lines written in a firm, precise hand that she recognized from the few notes Sebastian had sent her family during their courtship. Brief acknowledgments of invitations and arrangements that had been as impersonal as they were correct. The letter requested, though the formality of the language made it feel more like a summons, a meeting to discuss matters of mutual concern regarding the boundaries and management of neighbouring properties, proposing a visit to Thornbury Manor at her earliest convenience to address questions of water rights, shared maintenance of connecting roads, and the proper demarcation of property lines that had apparently grown unclear over years of neglect by the previous owners of the surrounding estates. There was nothing in the words themselves that could be construed as threatening or improper, nothing that revealed any emotion or personal interest, and yet Arabella felt as though she were reading a declaration of war written in the language of polite society. Each carefully chosen phrase, a move in some game whose rules she did not understand, and whose stakes she could not calculate. She set the letter down and stared at it, as though it might transform into something else, if she looked away and back again, her mind churning through possibilities and implications, wondering if she should refuse, if she should write back claiming illness or pressing business that made a meeting impossible, if she should perhaps flee once more, pack her belongings and seek refuge with some distant relation in Scotland or Ireland, anywhere beyond the reach of the man who now surrounded her on every side. But even as the thought formed, she knew it for the cowardice it was, knew that running again would solve nothing, would only compound the shame she already carried and leave her forever looking over her shoulder, forever wondering when and how he might choose to exact whatever revenge he sought for the humiliation she had caused him. Arabella spent the next hour drafting responses, her writing desk littered with crumpled attempts that ranged from coldly formal refusals to rambling apologies to brief acceptances that revealed nothing of the turmoil she felt, and each version seemed wrong in different ways, too distant or too revealing, too harsh or too weak, until finally she settled on a response that agreed to receive him in 3 days' time at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the brevity of her acceptance matching the businesslike tone of his request. The 3 days that followed were a peculiar torment of preparation and second-guessing, during which Arabella found herself compulsively cleaning rooms that had not been used since her arrival at Thornbury Manor, polishing silver that had not seen service in years, instructing Mrs. Davies to air out the formal drawing room and prepare the good china, all while insisting to herself and to her bemused housekeeper that she merely wished to maintain proper standards and certainly did not care what the Duke of Ashworth might think of her household. Mrs. Davies, who had served Arabella faithfully since her retreat to Derbyshire and who possessed the particular wisdom of those who have observed human nature through decades of service, said nothing but watched her mistress with eyes that were both concerned and knowing, offering no commentary on the unusual flurry of activity or the anxiety that drove it. At night, Arabella lay awake rehearsing conversations that might occur, practicing various tones and approaches, wondering whether she should apologize immediately and profusely, whether she should maintain a distant formality and refuse to acknowledge the past, whether she owed him explanations, or whether the best course was to treat him as she would any neighboring landowner and pretend that there was no history between them beyond the ordinary concerns of property management, though even she recognized the absurdity of such pretense, given the enormity of what had passed between them. Sebastian arrived at precisely 2 o'clock on the appointed day, and Arabella watched from behind the curtain of her upstairs window as his carriage rolled up the drive, with the Ashworth crest gleaming in gold upon its black lacquered door, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she pressed a hand to her chest, as though she might physically contain the tumult within. And when Mrs. Davies announced him moments later, Arabella descended the stairs with a composure that was entirely counterfeit, her hands gripping her skirts to hide their trembling as she entered the formal drawing-room where he stood waiting near the fireplace, tall and imposing in perfectly tailored dark wool, his posture as rigid as she remembered, though there was something in his face that was different from the man she had left at the altar 3 years prior, something in the set of his mouth and the shadows beneath his grey eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens carried in silence. He bowed with flawless correctness as she entered, and she curtsied in return, the formality of these gestures creating a buffer of ritual between them that allowed her to breathe, to speak the conventional words of welcome, to gesture toward the chairs arranged before the tea service that Mrs. Davies had prepared with exquisite care, and for several minutes they occupied themselves with the mechanics of pouring and accepting cups, of offering sugar and cream, of commenting on the weather which had turned fine after several days of rain, all of it a performance of normalcy that both of them executed with the skill of those trained from birth in the arts of polite dissemblance. The conversation turned, as his letter had promised, to matters of estate management, and Sebastian's voice as he discussed water rights and boundary maintenance was measured and careful, each word precisely chosen, his tone revealing nothing beyond professional courtesy. Yet Arabella found herself watching him with an attention that went beyond the surface of his words, noticing how his hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he lifted his teacup, how his gaze remained fixed on the middle distance rather than meeting her eyes directly, how a muscle in his jaw tightened when she asked a question about the shared road that required repair, and she began to understand that this meeting was as much an ordeal for him as it was for her, that whatever control he projected was purchased at considerable cost. They discussed the practical matters for perhaps 20 minutes, reaching agreements about cost-sharing for road repairs and establishing protocols for managing the stream that marked one boundary of their properties, and through it all Arabella felt the weight of everything unsaid, pressing down upon the room like a physical force. The ghost of that terrible day at Street, Michael's Cathedral hovering between them though neither acknowledged it, and when at last Sebastian set down his cup and rose to take his leave, formal thanks for her time falling from his lips with the same careful precision as everything else he had said. Arabella felt something almost like disappointment that they would part with all of it still unspoken, all of it still raw and festering beneath the veneer of civility. He moved toward the door, and she rose to accompany him, maintaining the proper distance, and it was there in the doorway that he paused, his hand on the frame, his body half-turned, as though some invisible force held him between departure and remaining. And for a heartbeat, she thought he might speak, might say something that acknowledged the enormity of what lay between them, but then whatever impulse had seized him released its hold, and he merely bowed once more, his face a mask of courteous indifference, and was gone, leaving Arabella standing alone in the drawing-room, with her heart still racing, and the certainty that whatever game was being played between them had only just begun. The strange occurrences began 3 days after Sebastian's visit, when Arabella ventured out on her morning walk and discovered that the old stone bridge connecting her property to the main road, which had been in dangerous disrepair for the better part of a year, with loose stones and crumbling mortar that made crossing it a precarious endeavor she had learned to navigate with extreme care, had been completely restored overnight. The stonework expertly repointed and reinforced, new timber supports installed beneath the span, the entire structure looking as sound and solid as it must have been when first constructed half a century prior. And when she questioned Mrs. Davies about whether any workmen had been seen on the property, the housekeeper shook her head with an expression of equal bewilderment and reported that no one had come to the manor house itself, though she had heard the sounds of hammering and voices carrying on the wind the previous evening after sunset. Over the following week, more inexplicable improvements appeared with the quiet persistence of morning dew, each one addressing some need or deficiency that Arabella had learned to accept as part of her reduced circumstances, and her tenant farmers began mentioning in their conversations with her that the Duke's estate manager had been remarkably generous in matters of shared resources, allowing them access to better grazing lands along the boundary properties, and providing seed grain at cost when their own supplies ran short after a difficult planting season, gestures that flew in the face of the revenge or punishment Arabella had been bracing herself to endure. The fallen oak that had blocked the access path to her southern fields, brought down in a storm weeks earlier, and too massive for her small staff to move without hiring additional labor she could ill afford, vanished one night as completely as though it had been spirited away by invisible hands, and in its place she found the path not merely cleared, but graded and gravelled, transformed from a muddy track into a proper lane that would serve well through even the wettest seasons, and she stood staring at this evidence of care and effort expended on her behalf, with a confusion that bordered on distress, because she could not reconcile such kindness with any motive she understood, could not fit these silent gestures into the narrative of entrapment or retribution that had seemed so obvious when she first learned of his property purchases. Mrs. Davies, during one of their quiet evenings in the kitchen, while Arabella helped shell peas for the next day's dinner in a companionable domesticity that ignored the boundaries usually maintained between mistress and servant, mentioned with studied casualness that she had observed the Duke himself riding the boundaries of his various properties each morning and evening, always mounted on the same great black horse, always alone, and that he seemed to pause longest at those points where Thornbury Manor came into view, sitting motionless in his saddle for minutes at a time, as though committing the sight to memory, or perhaps keeping vigil over something precious and fragile. And Arabella felt something shift in her chest at this intelligence, a crack appearing in the wall of assumptions she had built around Sebastian's intentions, and she began to wonder with an uncertainty that was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating whether his purchase of the surrounding estates had truly been about trapping her within a cage of his making, or whether it might have been about something else entirely, something her fear and guilt had prevented her from seeing, something that manifested not in demands or confrontations, but in bridges repaired and paths cleared and careful distance maintained, in protection offered without expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement, in a kind of devotion that asked for nothing in return. The annual harvest festival arrived with the turning of September into October, when the village common transformed into a tapestry of color and celebration, with stalls displaying the season's bounty of apples and squash and late corn, bunting strung between the ancient oaks that ringed the green, and the air filled with the mingled scents of wood smoke and cider and fresh-baked bread. And Arabella had attended every year since taking up residence at Thornbury Manor, always contributing generously to the church fund and helping Mrs. Cooper organize the baking competition, and spending her coins freely at the various stalls in a way that ensured the village families would have a prosperous day. So her arrival that afternoon, in a simple dress of deep amber wool, was greeted with warm smiles and respectful curtsies from the assembled villagers who had long since accepted her as one of their own, despite the whispers that had followed, and her from London 3 years prior. She was examining a display of preserves at the widow Hartley's stall, discussing the merits of blackberry versus damson jam, with an attention that was only partly feigned as distraction from her own churning thoughts, when a ripple of awareness moved through the crowd like wind through grain, conversations pausing mid-sentence and heads turning toward the lane that led from the main road, and Arabella looked up to see Sebastian arriving on foot rather than in his carriage, dressed not in the formal attire of a duke, but in simple country gentleman's clothing that nevertheless fit him with the precision that marked quality tailoring, and she watched from her position across the green as the villagers regarded him with uncertain deference, unsure how to receive this nobleman who had purchased so much of their land yet remained a stranger to them, their bodies conveying that peculiar tension of those who must be respectful to power while harboring reservations about its intentions. But Sebastian moved among them with a warmth that surprised Arabella as much as it clearly surprised the villagers themselves, stopping to speak with old Mr. Jenkins about the quality of this year's wheat harvest, crouching down to admire young Tommy Fletcher's prize pumpkin with genuine interest that made the boy's face shine with pride, and contributing such a substantial sum to the church fund that the vicar's stammered thanks seemed inadequate to the gesture, and Arabella found herself watching him with an attention she could not quite disguise, seeing in these small interactions a man very different from the cold duke of reputation, seeing instead someone who understood how to put others at ease when he chose to make the effort, someone whose natural reserve could be overcome by conscious intention toward kindness. Their paths converged at the baked goods stall, where Mrs. Cooper presided over an array of pies and tarts, and the moment of meeting was awkward in the way such encounters always are, when two people who occupy each other's thoughts constantly must pretend to casual acquaintance before observers, and they managed a stilted exchange about the weather, which had been fine for the harvest and the impressive turnout of villagers, words that meant nothing and everything, their voices carefully modulated to suggest polite neighborliness, while their eyes held depths of meaning that neither could acknowledge. And it was then that little Sarah Thompson, the blacksmith's daughter of perhaps 5 years, came running through the crowd with the heedless speed of childhood and caught her foot on an uneven patch of ground, stumbling forward with a cry of alarm, and both Sebastian and Arabella moved simultaneously to catch her, their hands meeting around the child's small body as they steadied her, and for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, Arabella felt the warmth of his fingers against hers, felt the current that passed between them at that contact, and when their eyes met over the child's head, the look they exchanged was complex and painful, and full of everything neither could say in this public place, full of regret and longing, and a question that hung unanswered in the space between them. And then the moment passed as Sarah's mother rushed over with profuse thanks, and they released both the child and each other, stepping back into their respective solitudes. But that night, as Arabella lay in her bed watching moonlight pattern the ceiling of her chamber, she could not stop thinking about the gentleness she had seen in him as he spoke to the villagers, the way his face had softened when he smiled at the children, the warmth in his eyes when they had touched, and she understood with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating that she had perhaps misjudged something fundamental about Sebastian Ashworth, that the man she had fled from and the man she was coming to know might be separated not by deception but by her own failure to truly see him. And this realization settled in her chest with the weight of possibility, heavy and sweet and utterly transforming. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October, with the sudden ferocity that characterizes autumn tempests in the countryside, the wind rising from a whisper to a roar in the span of minutes, and bringing with it sheets of rain that lashed against the windows of Thornbury Manor, with violence enough to rattle the ancient glass in its frames, and Arabella had retreated to her study on the ground floor, where she felt safer than in her upstairs chambers, listening to the oak branches scraping against the slate roof above, with sounds like skeletal fingers clawing for purchase, when she heard the terrible crack and crash that signaled something had given way beneath the onslaught of wind and water, and morning revealed the extent of the damage when she stood in the east wing bedroom and stared up through a hole in the ceiling at the grey sky beyond. A section of roof, perhaps 8 feet across, where fallen branches had punched through the old slate and exposed the timbers beneath to the elements, with water stains already spreading across the plaster ceiling of the room below and the acrid smell of wet wood permeating the air. She spent that morning in her study attempting to calculate the cost of repairs with a sinking heart, knowing that her carefully managed funds, which stretched to cover the manor's basic maintenance and her modest charitable contributions, would not extend to roofing work of this magnitude, knowing that she would have to make choices between fixing the roof properly and keeping enough reserves to see her household through the winter, her pencil moving across the paper in increasingly desperate calculations that never quite added up to anything but hardship. When Mrs. Davies appeared in the doorway with an expression of mingled concern and something else Arabella could not quite identify, and announced that the Duke of Ashworth was at the door requesting to see her on a matter of some urgency, Sebastian stood in her entrance hall still wearing his riding coat dark with rain at the shoulders, and when she entered, he turned to face her with an intensity in his grey eyes that made her breath catch, and without preamble, he said that he had been riding the boundaries of his northern property when he saw the damage to her roof, saw the branches that had fallen, and the obvious gap in the slates, and he wished to offer the services of his estate workers and whatever materials might be needed to effect repairs before further weather could worsen the situation. Arabella's first instinct was refusal born of pride, that stubborn independence that had sustained her through 3 years of reduced circumstances and would not easily bend even in the face of genuine need, and she heard herself saying that she could not possibly accept such generosity, that she would manage her own repairs in her own time. But Sebastian stepped closer with a movement that seemed almost unconscious and said quietly, with something very like pleading in his voice, that water damage would only spread and worsen, with the winter rains that would surely come, that structural timbers once compromised would cost far more to replace than preventive work would cost now, and he was not offering charity, but rather the practical assistance of one neighbor to another, the sort of mutual aid that had always characterized rural life. And would she not please, for the sake of her own safety and that of her household, accept his help in this matter? She looked at him standing there in her modest entrance hall, this duke who had every reason to let her suffer the consequences of her own limited resources, who had every justification for leaving her to manage alone after what she had done to him, and she saw in his face only genuine concern, untainted by any desire to humiliate or diminish her, saw the same careful respect he had shown in all their interactions since his return to her life, and she found herself nodding acceptance with a tightness in her throat that made speech difficult, managing only a whispered "thank you" that seemed inadequate to the moment. Over the 3 days that followed, Sebastian's workers swarmed over the damaged section of roof with the efficient purposefulness of men accustomed to such labor, replacing broken timbers and laying fresh slates with a precision that spoke of long practice, and Sebastian himself appeared each morning ostensibly to supervise their progress, but really, Arabella came to understand, simply to see her, to exchange brief words about the weather or the work, or some small matter of estate business that served as pretext for his presence, and she found herself watching for his arrival with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her, found herself lingering in rooms with windows that overlooked the work so that she might catch glimpses of him speaking with his foreman or examining the repairs, and gradually, carefully, they began to have conversations that lasted longer than mere courtesy required, standing in her garden or her drawing room while the sounds of hammering echoed from above, talking about matters both consequential and trivial in the way of two people learning to trust each other again. And with each exchange, Arabella felt something shift within her, some barrier crumbling beneath the steady pressure of his quiet kindness, and her own growing recognition that the man before her bore little resemblance to the cold duke she had fled from 3 years prior. On the final day of repairs, the sky darkened again with the promise of another autumn squall, clouds gathering like bruises on the horizon as the workers hastened to complete their task before the weather broke, and Sebastian stood in the garden, watching the last slates being secured when the first heavy drops began to fall, spattering against the flagstones with increasing urgency, and Arabella appeared at the door of the manor, calling to him over the rising wind that he must come inside before he was soaked through, that the work was done, and there was no purpose in catching his death in the rain, and he followed her into the warmth of her drawing room, where Mrs. Davies had already laid a tea service and built up the fire against the chill, and they stood for a moment in awkward silence, as water dripped from Sebastian's coat onto the Turkish carpet, and the sound of rain intensified against the windows, and Arabella gestured for him to sit while she poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and when she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed, and she felt that same current of awareness that had passed between them at the harvest festival, that undeniable connection that seemed to exist beneath and beyond all their careful formality. The rain became a downpour, sheeting against the glass with violence enough to obscure the view of the garden beyond, creating a cocoon of intimacy in the firelit room, and Sebastian set down his cup with a deliberation that suggested he was gathering courage, and then he asked in a voice barely above a whisper whether she had ever wondered why he had truly bought the properties surrounding Thornbury Manor, and Arabella felt her heart begin to race as she admitted that yes, she had wondered, had assumed in her darker moments that it was revenge of some kind, or perhaps a strategy to force her into some situation of dependence or obligation, and she watched his face as she spoke and saw something like pain cross his features, saw the tightening around his eyes that suggested her words had wounded him, though he bore it in silence. He looked away toward the fire, and when he spoke his voice was low and careful, as though he were navigating treacherous ground, and he told her that he had bought them to protect her, that in the months after she had left him standing at the altar, he had found himself unable to simply forget about her existence, as perhaps he should have done, had instead made quiet inquiries through mutual acquaintances about her circumstances, had learned of her reduced finances and her determination to maintain her independence in the country, and he had also learned something that had filled him with a cold fury that surprised him with its intensity, that there were men, unscrupulous men of business and diminished fortune, who had identified her as a potential target, a woman alone with property and no male protection, and who had considered purchasing land near hers with the explicit intention of making her life difficult enough that she might be pressured into marriage for the sake of security. Sebastian's hands clenched on his knees as he spoke of this, the careful control slipping enough to show the anger beneath, and he said that he could not bear the thought of her being harassed or threatened by such men, that whatever had passed between them, whatever pain she had caused him or shame he had endured, she deserved to live in peace and safety, and so he had systematically purchased every property adjacent to hers to ensure that she would be surrounded only by land controlled by someone who would never, could never, wish her harm, even if she hated him for all eternity, even if she never spoke to him again, even if his very presence in her vicinity caused her distress. His voice broke slightly on these last words, and a crack in the facade that revealed depths of feeling he had worked so hard to conceal, and Arabella sat frozen in her chair, staring at him as the full meaning of what he was saying penetrated her understanding, realizing that everything she had believed about his motives had been utterly, catastrophically wrong, that his encirclement of her property had not been a trap but a shield, not possession but protection, and the revelation struck her with a force that left her breathless, her entire understanding of the past months shifting and reforming into a pattern she had been too blind or too frightened to see, and she felt tears begin to slip down her cheeks as she comprehended the magnitude of his quiet, steadfast care for her well-being, even when she had given him every reason to wish her nothing but ill. Arabella sat motionless in her chair as the weight of Sebastian's confession settled over her like a physical thing, understanding now the true nature of his actions and feeling the foundations of her assumptions crumbling beneath this new knowledge, and she realized with a clarity that was almost painful that she owed him the same honesty he had just given her, and that the silence between them could not be bridged unless she spoke the truth she had carried alone for 3 years. And so she set down her teacup with trembling hands and began to speak in a voice that shook with emotion she could no longer contain, telling him that she must explain why she had run from him on that terrible day, why she had committed an act of such cruelty and cowardice that had haunted her every day since. She spoke of the rumors that had reached her ears in the weeks before their wedding. Whispers passed between ladies behind fans at social gatherings, and murmured warnings from concerned acquaintances who claimed to have her best interests at heart. Tales of his alleged cruelty to servants who displeased him, of business rivals he had supposedly ruined through ruthless manipulation, of his first betrothal that had ended under mysterious circumstances that no one would quite explain, but everyone hinted at darkly, and she admitted with shame burning in her cheeks that she had listened to this gossip, had allowed it to plant seeds of fear in her heart, because she had not known him well enough to trust her own judgment over the judgment of society. She told him how their courtship had been so brief and so formal, chaperoned conversations in drawing rooms where they spoke of nothing consequential, dances at balls where propriety dictated every movement and word, walks in gardens with her mother trailing 3 steps behind, and through it all, she had seen only the face he showed the world, that carefully controlled expression that revealed nothing of his inner self, and she had felt increasingly like an object being appraised and acquired rather than a woman being courted, had felt the weight of family expectations and social pressure pushing her toward a marriage she had not chosen but could not refuse without bringing shame upon her house. She described standing at the altar that day in her white gown, with her heart hammering against her ribs, looking up at him as he stood tall and imposing beside her, and seeing in his grey eyes something that terrified her, though she could not name it then, and realized only now had been his own fear, reflected back at her. But in that moment of panic, she had seen only coldness and distance, and the confirmation of every dark whisper she had heard, had felt with absolute certainty that she was about to bind herself for life to a man who might hurt her in ways she could not even imagine. And so she had run and had gathered her skirts and fled down the aisle, while the entire congregation watched in horrified silence, had run like a coward from a fate she had convinced herself would destroy her. She spoke of her shame and guilt in the years that followed, how she had told herself she had done the right thing in choosing freedom over obligation, but how she had also wondered in the dark hours of sleepless nights whether she had destroyed an innocent man's reputation based on nothing more than gossip and her own fear. And she admitted now, with tears streaming down her face, that she had been wrong, catastrophically and unforgivably wrong, that she had judged him without knowing him, and had believed the worst of him because it was easier than being brave enough to learn the truth, and she could not express the depth of her regret for the humiliation she had caused him, for the pain she had inflicted through her cowardice. Sebastian had listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each revelation, his hands gripping the arms of his chair with white-knuckled intensity, and when she finally fell silent, exhausted by the confession, he sat unmoving for a long moment, while the rain drummed against the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth. And then he spoke in a voice rough with emotion, asking her permission to tell her the truth about those rumors, about the man he really was beneath the reputation he had accidentally cultivated through years of social awkwardness and protective reserve, and Arabella nodded through her tears, knowing that whatever he was about to reveal could not be worse than the not knowing that had poisoned her judgment 3 years ago. Sebastian leaned forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as though in prayer, or perhaps in an effort to keep them from trembling, and he began to speak in a voice that was low and careful, each word chosen with the precision of a man who had carried these truths alone for far too long, and he told her that his father had been everything a duke should be: warm, gregarious, and beloved by tenants and peers alike, a man who could command a room with his laughter and inspire loyalty with his genuine care for those beneath his protection, but that Sebastian himself had been born different, quieter, more given to books than balls, more comfortable with silence than with the performative social graces that came so naturally to his father. And when his father had died suddenly when Sebastian was only 19, struck down by a fever that took him in less than a week, Sebastian had inherited not only a title and vast responsibilities, but also the impossible task of filling shoes that had never been meant for feet like his. He spoke of how he had tried in those early years to be what everyone expected, to smile and charm and navigate society with his father's easy grace, but it had felt like wearing a costume that did not fit, and each failure had driven him further into himself, into the protective reserve that felt safer than vulnerability, and he had learned through painful experience that showing emotion in public was interpreted as weakness by those who circled the young duke like wolves assessing wounded prey, and so he had constructed a careful facade of control and coldness that he thought would protect him, but which had instead isolated him in ways he had not anticipated. He told her about the servant he had dismissed, the incident that had spawned the rumors of cruelty, explaining that the man had been systematically stealing from the older members of staff, taking advantage of their failing eyesight and memory to pilfer their meager savings. And when Sebastian had discovered it and confronted him, the man had begged for mercy, had wept and pleaded, but Sebastian had thought of the elderly housekeeper who had served his family for 40 years and who had been left with almost nothing, and he had been unmoved by the thief's tears, had dismissed him without a reference, and made sure other households knew why, and the man in his bitterness had spread vicious lies about the young duke's character that society had been all too willing to believe because they fit the narrative of the cold, heartless nobleman. He spoke of the businessmen he had supposedly ruined, revealing that they had been systematically defrauding tenant farmers, using complicated lease agreements to charge excessive rents while providing none of the improvements they had promised. And Sebastian had spent months gathering evidence and had exposed them publicly, had used his influence to ensure they faced consequences for their corruption, and yes, their businesses had failed and their reputations had been destroyed, but he felt no remorse for that, because justice had demanded it, though he understood now how it had added to his reputation as a ruthless man who crushed anyone who crossed him. Then he told her about his first betrothal, his voice softening with something like fondness, explaining that Lady Catherine Winters had been a kind young woman whom he had genuinely liked and respected, and their families had arranged the match when they were both very young. But as they grew older and spent more time together, it became clear that while they were friends, there was no spark of romance between them, and then Catherine had met someone else, a second son with no title and modest fortune, and she had fallen deeply in love, though she had been too honorable to break the engagement herself, and Sebastian, seeing her misery, had gone to her privately and released her from their arrangement, had asked only that she be happy, and had even helped smooth the way with both families by taking the blame himself, by allowing everyone to believe she had rejected him rather than the other way around, because he had cared for her enough to protect her reputation even at the cost of his own. But society had interpreted it as another sign of his fundamental undesirability, had whispered that even a woman, contractually bound to him, had found him too cold to bear. He looked at Arabella then with eyes that held years of accumulated pain, and he told her that by the time their own betrothal had been arranged, he had learned to wear his coldness like armor, and believed that showing any softness would only invite more hurt. But the truth was that during their brief courtship he had fallen for her, had found himself thinking about her at odd moments, had been moved by her kindness to servants and her obvious intelligence, but he had been too frightened to show it, too convinced that any display of genuine feeling would be rejected or mocked. And so on their wedding day, when he had stood at the altar waiting for her, he had been terrified. He had been trying desperately to appear strong and worthy, while inside he had been shaking with fear that she would see through to the uncertain man beneath the title, and he realized now that in trying to look strong, he had looked cruel instead, had presented exactly the face that would confirm every dark rumor she had heard. And when she had run from him, he had understood it as the final confirmation of what he had always feared, that he was fundamentally unlovable, too damaged by his own reserve to ever be chosen freely by anyone. Arabella felt the full weight of understanding crash over her like a wave, and she realized with devastating clarity the enormity of what she had done, how she had taken an innocent man who was already wounded by years of misunderstanding and social isolation, and had inflicted upon him the deepest humiliation imaginable, had confirmed his worst fears about himself in the most public and cruel way possible, and the knowledge of it broke something inside her that had been holding itself together through 3 years of guilt she had not fully acknowledged. She began to weep, not the delicate tears of a lady in a drawing room, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body, and she covered her face with her hands as though she could hide from the shame that consumed her, and through her tears she tried to speak, to apologize, to somehow articulate the profound regret that was tearing through her chest. But the words came out broken and incoherent, fragments of "I'm sorry" And I didn't know, and how could I have been so blind that failed to capture even a fraction of what she felt? Sebastian, seeing her distress, moved instinctively from his chair, crossing the small space between them as though drawn by invisible threads, and he knelt beside her chair, his hands reaching toward her and then stopping, hovering in the air as though he wanted desperately to comfort her, but did not know if he had the right. And his own eyes were bright with unshed tears as he watched her fall apart beneath the weight of understanding. He told her in a voice rough with emotion that she must not blame herself so harshly, that the wedding had been an arrangement she had never truly consented to, that society had given her no real choice in the matter, and that she had been barely more than a girl being sold like property to a man she did not know. And what right did anyone have to demand she go through with such a thing simply because their families had agreed to it? And he said with fierce conviction that she had every right to refuse, every right to choose freedom over obligation, and he would not have her torment herself for an act of self-preservation that took more courage than most people would ever possess. But Arabella shook her head violently, her hands dropping from her face to reveal eyes red and swollen with crying, and she insisted through gasping breaths that it was not the refusal she regretted but the manner of it and the public humiliation she had inflicted. The fact that she had believed vicious gossip over giving him even the smallest chance to show her who he truly was. And she told him that she had spent 3 years telling herself she had escaped something dangerous, when in truth she had destroyed something precious before it even had the chance to begin. And how could he possibly forgive such willful blindness, such cowardice dressed up as self-protection? The conversation between them had stripped away every pretense and formality. It had left them both raw and exposed in ways that were painful and necessary, and they sat together in that small drawing room while the rain drummed steadily against the windows and the fire burned low in the hearth. Two people who had been shaped by misunderstanding and fear, finally seeing each other with complete clarity. The silence that fell between them was heavy with everything they had said and everything they had not said, with the weight of 3 lost years, and the possibility of what might still be salvaged from the wreckage of their past. And Arabella felt simultaneously more ashamed than she had ever been, and more hopeful than she had allowed herself to be since that terrible day at the altar. Finally, Sebastian spoke again, his voice steady now, though his eyes still shimmered with emotion, and he asked her if they might start again, not as duke and lady bound by family arrangement, not as wounded people carrying the baggage of their shared past, but simply as neighbors, perhaps as friends, as two people learning to know each other without the weight of expectation or the poison of rumor, and he promised her that he asked for nothing more than the chance to show her through his actions over time who he truly was beneath the title and the reputation, and if at the end of that time she still wished only for distance between them, he would respect that choice and never trouble her again. Arabella looked at him through her tears and saw in his face such naked hope and such fear of rejection that it made her heart ache, and she knew that what he was offering was extraordinary generosity, given what she had done to him. And she nodded slowly, finding her voice enough to say yes, she would like that very much, to start again as friends and see what truth might grow between them when fear and misunderstanding were cleared away. Though even as she spoke the word friends, both of them understood that something deeper was already beginning to take root, something that had perhaps been there all along, waiting for the chance to grow in soil that was not poisoned by assumptions and protective walls. And as they sat together in the firelight with the rain continuing its steady rhythm against the glass, they both felt the first tentative stirring of something that might, with patience and courage, transform into the kind of love that could heal even the deepest wounds. The weeks that followed their agreement to begin again unfolded with the gentle rhythm of autumn giving way to early winter, and Sebastian began to visit Thornbury Manor with a regularity that would have scandalized society, had society been paying attention. But here in the countryside, where propriety was measured more by genuine respect than by rigid rules, his weekly visits for tea became an expected and welcomed occurrence that even Mrs. Davies anticipated with visible pleasure, setting out the good china and baking fresh scones on those appointed afternoons. They began cautiously, these two people who had wounded and been wounded, circling each other like dancers learning unfamiliar steps, their conversations at first touching only on safe topics: the management of estates, the needs of tenant farmers, the approaching winter and what preparations it demanded. But gradually, As trust accumulated through the simple act of showing up week after week without fail, their talks deepened and ranged into territory that revealed who they truly were beneath their careful social masks. Arabella discovered that Sebastian had an extensive library that rivaled her own love of books, and when she mentioned in passing her admiration for a particular poet, he arrived the following week with a volume of that poet's work, and they spent the entire afternoon reading passages aloud to each other, their voices weaving together in the firelit drawing room, while outside the first snow began to fall, and she saw in those moments how his face transformed when he spoke of things he loved, how the hardness left his eyes, and something almost boyish emerged, vulnerable and beautiful. They began to take walks along the boundary between their properties, following the old stone wall that had once seemed like a division, but which now felt more like a thread connecting their lands and their lives. And during these walks, Sebastian spoke of his childhood, of growing up in his father's shadow, and feeling always that he was a disappointment to a man who had loved him, but never quite understood his quiet nature. And Arabella in turn shared memories of her own upbringing, of parents who had seen her as a commodity to be traded for social advancement, rather than as a person with her own dreams and fears, and they found in each other a recognition of what it meant to have been shaped by expectations they could never quite meet. Sebastian revealed a dry wit that surprised her with its sharpness and timing, delivering observations about local society or estate matters with such deadpan delivery that it took her a moment to realize he was being humorous, and then she would laugh in a way she had not laughed in years, free and unself-conscious, and each time she laughed, his smile grew a little wider, as though her joy was water to something parched within him. The village began to notice their growing friendship and to gossip about it, but the gossip was gentle and hopeful rather than cruel, for Sebastian had won over the local people through his fairness as a landlord and his genuine interest in their welfare. And they had long loved Arabella for her kindness and charity, and watching the two of them walk together through the village or sit side by side at church seemed to the villagers like witnessing something that had always been meant to be, but had simply taken a difficult path to fruition. Mrs. Davies watched it all with the satisfaction of someone who had known from the beginning how the story would end, though she kept her knowing smiles to herself and simply ensured that the tea was always hot and the biscuits always fresh when the Duke arrived. One cold afternoon in late November, Sebastian appeared at her door carrying a package wrapped in brown paper, and when Arabella opened it, she found a first edition of her favorite novel, one she had mentioned weeks ago in passing during a conversation about childhood reading, and the fact that he had remembered such a small detail and had gone to the trouble of finding this particular edition, which she knew must have been difficult to locate, touched her so deeply that tears sprang to her eyes, and when she looked up at him to thank him, she saw in his expression such tender hope, such careful attention to her reaction, that something shifted irrevocably in her heart, and she understood with sudden clarity that what she felt for him had moved far beyond friendship, into territory that both thrilled and terrified her, for she was falling in love with this man she had once fled from, this man she had so profoundly misjudged, and the realization filled her with a joy so intense it was almost painful, because it came hand in hand with the knowledge that she did not know if he could ever see her as anything more than a friend he was being kind to, whether the love she felt could ever be returned by someone she had hurt so deeply. And that night after he had gone, she held the book to her chest and wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming complexity of loving someone while carrying the weight of what she had done to him, of wanting so desperately to be worthy of a second chance she was not certain she deserved. The letter arrived on a grey December morning when frost still clung to the windows of Thornbury Manor, and the world outside seemed suspended in that peculiar stillness that comes before snow, and Arabella recognized the heavy cream paper and official seal as belonging to Sebastian's London solicitor before she even broke the wax, assuming it concerned some routine matter of estate business or boundary agreements that required her acknowledgement. She opened it in her morning room, while Mrs. Davies brought tea, scanning the formal language about property transfers and tenant agreements, but it was the messenger, a young clerk from London, who lingered awkwardly in the hall, who delivered the information that would shatter the fragile happiness she had been building, for when Mrs. Davies offered him refreshment before his journey back, he mentioned in the casual way of servants who do not realize the weight of their words that the Duke was facing, considerable pressure from society to marry soon, that his position required an heir, and the great families of London were circling with their eligible daughters like hawks, sighting prey, and several prominent matches were being actively negotiated by relations and well-meaning friends who felt 3 years of mourning. His failed engagement was quite enough. Arabella felt the words strike her like physical blows, each one landing with precision against the hope she had been nurturing in secret, and she realized with devastating clarity that she had been living in a fantasy, that their walks and talks and shared books existed in a bubble separate from the real world, where Sebastian was a duke with responsibilities that extended far beyond his personal preferences, where his title demanded he produce an heir to carry on his line, where society would never forgive him, choosing a woman who had publicly humiliated him over a fresh match with someone untainted by scandal. She dismissed the messenger with mechanical politeness and sat alone in her morning room as the tea grew cold, understanding that no matter how deep their friendship had grown, no matter what feelings might exist between them, she could not ask him to sacrifice his duty for her, could not let him ruin himself socially by pursuing something with a woman whose very name was synonymous with the worst scandal of the previous season. And the most loving thing she could do, the only honorable thing, was to withdraw before either of them became more entangled than they already were. The following week, when Sebastian arrived for their customary Tuesday tea, Arabella met him with a coolness that cost her everything to maintain, making excuses about being unwell, keeping the visit brief and formal, and when he suggested their usual walk, she declined, citing the cold weather and pressing correspondence, and she saw the confusion and hurt flash across his face before he carefully masked it behind the ducal politeness she had not seen from him in months. She began refusing his visits with increasing frequency, sending notes, claiming headaches or prior commitments, and when they did meet by chance in the village or at church, she kept their conversations to mere pleasantries, never allowing the intimacy that had become natural between them to resurface. And she watched as the openness gradually left his expression, as the walls she had seen him dismantle brick by careful brick began to rebuild themselves, and it broke her heart, even as she told herself it was necessary, that she was saving them both from a future impossibility. 3 weeks into her withdrawal, Sebastian appeared at Thornbury Manor unannounced one cold evening, just as darkness was falling, and the first snow had begun to drift down in lazy spirals, and Mrs. Davies showed him into the drawing-room where Arabella sat pretending to read, and when she looked up at him, she saw something in his face that was both desperate and angry, a breaking of the careful control he always maintained, and before she could offer some polite excuse, he demanded in a voice tight with emotion to know what had changed, what he had done, why she had suddenly shut him out after months of growing closer, and she realized she could not simply send him away with vague excuses, that he deserved more than that, even if the truth would hurt them both. She stood from her chair, maintaining distance between them as though proximity might weaken her resolve, and she told him, with a calmness she did not feel, that their friendship had been inappropriate from the beginning, that she had been selfish to indulge in it, knowing his position required him to marry well and produce an heir, that she had heard about the pressure he faced from society and the eligible women being put forward, and that he should focus on his duties rather than wasting time with someone whose presence in his life could only damage his prospects and his reputation. And she said all of this looking at a point just past his shoulder because she could not bear to meet his eyes. When she finally did look at his face, she saw the same closed, frozen expression that had terrified her at the altar 3 years ago, and she understood with terrible irony that she had managed to hurt him again in almost exactly the same way, by choosing fear and assumption over trust and truth. Sebastian did not leave, did not retreat behind the mask of ducal politeness she had just witnessed sliding back into place, but instead remained planted in the center of her drawing room with something blazing in his eyes that she had never seen before, a kind of desperate fury that came from a man pushed beyond the limits of his carefully maintained control. And when he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous, in a way that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with the breaking of something long restrained. "Do you believe I care about society's demands?" he asked, and the question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and before she could formulate an answer, he continued, his voice rising with each word, the careful modulation she had grown accustomed to shattering into something raw and unguarded. Do you believe I've spent 3 years buying properties, repairing your bridge, fixing your roof, bringing you books, visiting you weekly, because of duty, because of social obligation, because I had nothing better to occupy my time? He took a step toward her, and she saw his hands were shaking, clenched into fists at his sides, as though he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her, and the careful distance he had always maintained between them seemed suddenly like a chasm he was preparing to cross, whether she wished it or not. "I loved you before our wedding day," he said, and the confession struck her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and the strength from her knees. "I agreed to the arrangement our families made not because of duty, but because I had fallen for you during our brief courtship, during those formal, stilted visits, where I was too terrified to show you anything of what I truly felt, where I sat across from you making banal conversation about weather and estate management, while my heart was beating so hard I thought surely you must hear it." His voice broke on the words, and she saw tears standing in his eyes, unshed but present, and the sight of this proud, controlled man coming apart before her was almost more than she could bear. "When you ran from that altar, when you looked at me with such fear in your eyes and fled, it shattered me in ways I still have not fully recovered from, but I understood even then that I had failed you, that my inability to show you what I felt had contributed to your terror, and so I let you go, because that is what you do when you love someone. You give them the freedom to choose, even when that choice breaks you." He was closer now, near enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, could smell the faint scent of cold air and horses that clung to his coat, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "These 3 years I spent in London, fulfilling my duties, attending Parliament, managing my estates, being the duke that society demanded I be. But every moment I was thinking of you, wondering if you were well, if you were happy, if you ever thought of me with anything other than relief at your escape, and when I learned through my solicitor that you were struggling financially, that your estate was in difficulties, that there were men circling you like predators sensing weakness, I could not bear it." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but the emotion in it was thunderous, overwhelming. "I bought those properties not to trap you but to protect you, and yes, I will not lie, because I could not stand the thought of being far from you, of some other man owning land that bordered yours, of not being able to ride out each morning and see your estate in the distance, and know that you were safe, that you were near, even if you could never be mine." She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand, not commanding but pleading, begging her to let him finish what he had started. "These months of friendship we have shared have been the greatest torture and the greatest joy of my life. Sitting with you over tea, walking beside you, hearing you laugh, seeing you slowly trust me enough to share your thoughts and your memories, all while knowing that I could never tell you what I truly felt, because I was terrified of frightening you away again, terrified that if you knew the depth of what I felt, you would run as you had before, and I would rather have you in my life as a friend than not have you at all." He took one more step, and now they were so close she could have reached out and touched him, could have closed the distance between them with barely any effort, and his eyes searched hers with such naked hope and fear that she felt her own tears beginning to fall. "I love you, Arabella," he said, and the words were both declaration and surrender, both claim and gift. "I have loved you since before I understood what love was. I loved you on our wedding day when I stood at that altar, trying so hard to appear worthy of you that I appeared cold instead. I loved you through 3 years of separation. I have loved you through every tea, every walk, every moment we have spent rebuilding what was broken, and I will love you for the rest of my life, whether you return that love or not, whether you send me away tonight or allow me to stay, because that is simply who I am now, a man who loves you, who will always love you, and who cannot pretend otherwise for one more moment, even if the truth of it costs me everything." Arabella stood stunned into silence by Sebastian's confession, her mind reeling as it struggled to process the magnitude of what he had just revealed, and she felt as though she were watching their entire shared history rearrange itself before her eyes, like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their proper places, each moment she had misunderstood now blazing with new and terrible clarity. His frozen face at the altar had not been coldness but fear, the same paralyzing terror she herself had felt, two frightened people standing before God, and society trying desperately to appear brave, and instead appearing to each other as strangers carved from ice. His 3 years of silence after she fled had not been indifference or wounded pride, but respect for her choice, the kind of selfless love that releases rather than clutches, that honors the beloved's freedom even when it breaks the lover's heart. His careful friendship these past months had not been mere politeness or neighborly duty, but restrained love, every tea, every walk, every shared book, a gift he had given her while keeping his true feelings locked away because he feared that revealing them would send her running again, and she understood now the extraordinary courage it had taken for him to remain in her presence, to rebuild trust brick by patient brick, when what he wanted was to gather her into his arms and never let her go. She realized with devastating clarity that she had been a coward twice once, when she ran from the altar in a white gown with roses scattered at her feet, and again now when she had tried to push him away to avoid the possibility of future pain, and both times she had hurt him through her fear, had chosen assumption and self-protection over trust and vulnerability, and the pattern shamed her even as it revealed something essential about herself that she needed to change. She took a trembling step toward him, closing the small distance that separated them in her drawing room, where the fire had burned low and the snow continued to fall silently outside the windows, and she reached tentatively for his hand, half expecting him to pull away but needing to touch him, to ground this moment in something physical and real. His hand was warm despite the cold evening, and when her fingers closed around his she felt him shudder, as though her touch had broken something open inside him, and she had to speak quickly before her courage failed, before fear could rise up again and steal this chance from both of them. "I have been such a fool," she said, and her voice shook, but she forced herself to continue, to give him the truth he had been brave enough to give her. "I see now what I could not see then, that you were as frightened as I was, that beneath the Duke was a man who loved me and did not know how to show it, that everything I interpreted as coldness was simply fear wearing a different face, and I am so desperately sorry for not having the courage to look deeper, to ask, to trust." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she did not release his hand, instead gripped it tighter, as though it were the only solid thing in a tilting world. "These months of friendship have shown me who you truly are, kind, thoughtful, generous, gentle, possessing a dry humor that makes me laugh when I least expect it, and somewhere along the way, without meaning to, without planning it, I fell in love with you, Sebastian, not with the Duke of Ashworth, but with the man who brings me first editions of my favorite books, and remembers how I take my tea and looks at me as though I am something precious, rather than something damaged." She saw his eyes widen, saw hope kindle there like a flame catching, and she rushed on before she lost her nerve. "If you can forgive my catastrophic mistake, if you can forget that I humiliated you before all of society and spent 3 years believing the worst of you, then I would like to try again, not as an arrangement made by our families, not as duty or obligation or social expectation, but as two people who choose each other freely, who see each other clearly, and who love each other despite and because of all that has come before." She looked up at him through her tears and waited, barely breathing, for his response, and in that suspended moment she understood that this was what courage truly meant, not the absence of fear but the willingness to be vulnerable despite it, to offer one's heart knowing it might be refused, to choose love over safety and trust over certainty. Sebastian took both her hands in his, and she felt the trembling in his fingers, the physical manifestation of emotion so profound that even his considerable control could not entirely contain it, and when he spoke his voice was thick with feeling, but also suffused with a tenderness that made her heart ache with the beauty of it. "There is nothing to forgive," he said, and the words were both absolution and gift, the granting of a grace she had not known she needed until this moment. "Fear is not a crime, Arabella, and you had every reason to be frightened. I gave you no reason to trust me, showed you nothing of my heart, and expected you to bind yourself to a stranger based on arrangements made by others, and that was unfair to you in ways I did not understand until it was too late." His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands, the gesture unconscious and infinitely precious. "Loving you means accepting all of you, including the choices you made when you were afraid, including the pain those choices caused us both, because those experiences have shaped who we are now, have brought us to this moment where we stand before each other with clear eyes and open hearts, and I would not trade that for anything." He drew in a deep breath, and she saw him gathering his courage for what came next, saw him preparing to risk everything one more time, and she loved him all the more for his willingness to be vulnerable, despite how thoroughly she had hurt him before. "Arabella Thornton," he said, and her name on his lips was a prayer and a promise. "Will you marry me? Not because our families arranged it, not because of duty or property or social expectation, not because you are alone and I am convenient, but because I love you with everything I am, because you have become essential to my happiness, because I want to spend every remaining day of my life learning new ways to make you smile, and because I believe I desperately hope that you love me too." The question hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous, and she saw in his eyes both the fear that she might refuse and the hope that she would accept, saw him bracing himself for either answer while silently pleading for the one he wanted. "Yes," she said, and the word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of her whole heart, and she saw the moment it reached him, saw his eyes widen and fill with tears that he did not try to hide, saw joy transform his face into something so beautiful it hurt to witness. "Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you. I will bind my life to yours, not because I must, but because I choose to, because I love you and I want nothing more than to build a life with you, to wake beside you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night, to face whatever comes together instead of alone." She was crying again, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow, of hope rather than regret. And when he pulled her into his arms, she went willingly, eagerly, wrapping her own arms around him and holding tight as though she could make up for 3 years of distance in the strength of her embrace. They stood together in the center of her small drawing room, where the fire had burned to embers and the snow had stopped falling outside, and when he lowered his head to kiss her, she rose on her toes to meet him halfway, and the kiss they shared was tender and sweet and full of promise, a sealing of vows not yet spoken but already written on their hearts. It was a kiss that tasted of salt from her tears and felt like coming home after a long journey, and when they finally drew apart, they were both smiling through their tears, foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air, and she thought that she had never been happier than in this moment of choosing him freely, of being chosen in return. From somewhere beyond the drawing-room door came the sound of Mrs. Davies bustling away with suspicious haste, and Arabella laughed, imagining her devoted housekeeper pressed against the door, listening to every word. And Sebastian laughed too, the sound rich and warm and unguarded, and she realized she had never heard him laugh like that before, without restraint or self-consciousness, and she vowed silently to make him laugh that way as often as she could for the rest of their lives together. Outside the window, the autumn rain had finally stopped, and late sunlight broke through the dispersing clouds, sending golden light streaming across the wet gardens and turning every water droplet into a tiny prism, and the world seemed to shimmer with promise and new beginnings, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, two people who had found their way to each other through darkness and emerged into light. 6 months had passed since that evening in her drawing room, when Sebastian had asked her to marry him for the second time, and spring had come again to Thornbury Manor, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the fulfillment of vows that would be spoken with full hearts rather than dutiful obligation, and Arabella stood in her bedchamber on the morning of her wedding day, feeling a peace so profound it seemed to emanate from the very center of her being. The small chapel at Thornbury Manor had been prepared with simple elegance white roses from the gardens she and Sebastian had walked together during their careful courtship, beeswax candles that filled the air with honeyed sweetness, and wooden pews that would hold only those people who had supported them through their unconventional journey toward this day. She had chosen a gown of cream silk rather than virginal white, elegant in its simplicity, with none of the elaborate embroidery and endless train that had weighed her down 3 years ago in that grand London church, and instead of the formal bouquet of hothouse flowers she had carried before, she held a loose gathering of wildflowers, picked that morning from her own gardens, daisies and lavender, and sweet William, tied with a simple ribbon. Mrs. Davies helped her dress, tears streaming down the dear woman's weathered face, murmuring about how she had known from the first day Sebastian appeared at their door that this was meant to be, and Arabella kissed her housekeeper's cheek and thanked her for believing when she herself had still been too frightened to hope. When the hour came, and she walked down the aisle of the small chapel, with sunlight streaming through the plain glass windows, she saw Sebastian waiting at the altar, and the contrast with that first wedding was so stark it nearly took her breath away. He was not frozen and distant, but trembling with visible emotion, his grey eyes shining with unshed tears of joy as he watched her approach, and his smile was so full of love and wonder that she felt her own eyes fill with answering tears. The vows they spoke were not the traditional words prescribed by convention, but personal promises they had written together, acknowledging the difficult road that had brought them to this moment, and pledging to build a future founded on honesty, trust, and the courage to be vulnerable with one another. And when the vicar asked if she would take Sebastian Ashworth as her husband, Arabella's "I do" rang out firm and joyful, without hesitation or doubt, and she saw Sebastian's shoulders relax as though he had been holding his breath against the possibility that she might run again. The kiss they shared as husband and wife was tender and sweet, and the small congregation erupted in genuine celebration, the villagers who had watched their careful courtship cheering and clapping, and Arabella heard Mrs. Davies sobbing happily in the front pew. The reception was held in the gardens of Thornbury Manor, with tables laden with food prepared by the village women and wine from Sebastian's cellars, and there was music and dancing and laughter that echoed across the grounds, and Arabella found herself watching her new husband with amazed delight as he relaxed completely for the first time since she had known him, his usual reserve melting away to reveal the warm, humorous, deeply feeling man who had always existed beneath the ducal armor. He danced with her 3 times, though convention dictated only 1, spun little Mary from the village until the child shrieked with giggles, told jokes with the tenant farmers that made them roar with surprised laughter, and when he caught Arabella watching him, he crossed the garden to pull her into his arms and kiss her thoroughly, despite the watching crowd, and she thought her heart might burst with the sheer joy of knowing that this man was hers and she was his, freely chosen and deeply loved. As evening fell and the guests began to depart with warm wishes and knowing smiles, Sebastian took her hand and led her back toward Thornbury Manor, which they had decided to keep as their primary residence rather than his grander ducal estate, and as they crossed the threshold together, he swept her into his arms and carried her up the stairs, while she laughed and protested that she was perfectly capable of walking, and he told her he had waited 3 years to carry his bride over the threshold, and he would not be denied the pleasure now, and when he laid her gently on the bed in the chamber they would share, his hands trembling slightly as he began to undo the buttons of her gown, she looked up at him and saw her own happiness reflected in his eyes, and she knew with absolute certainty that every moment of fear and pain and misunderstanding had been worth enduring to arrive at this moment of perfect love and perfect trust, and she drew him down to her with a whispered, "I love you," that he answered with his lips and his hands and his whole devoted heart. 5 years had passed since that spring wedding in Thornbury Manor's small chapel, and the passage of time had transformed not only the estates, but the people who inhabited them, weaving together properties and lives into something far richer than either Sebastian or Arabella could have imagined in those early days of careful friendship and tentative trust. The lands that surrounded Thornbury Manor, those 5 estates that had once seemed like walls closing in, instruments of entrapment or revenge, now flourished as testament to thoughtful stewardship and genuine care, the boundaries between properties blurred by shared purpose and unified vision, tenant farms prospering under fair management, village children attending the school Sebastian had built, and Arabella had helped staff with qualified teachers, the whole region thriving in ways that brought both Duke and Duchess profound satisfaction. On this particular autumn afternoon, golden light slanted across the gardens of Thornbury Manor, where Arabella walked hand in hand with Sebastian, their 2 young children running ahead on the path. Thomas, 4 years old, with his father's grey eyes and his mother's warm smile, and little Catherine, barely 2, her dark curls bouncing as she toddled after her brother with determined enthusiasm. Arabella watched Sebastian scoop Catherine into his arms when the child stumbled, watched him press a kiss to her forehead and murmur something that made her giggle, and her heart swelled with love for this man who had proven himself so utterly different from the cold Duke she had feared, this gentle father and devoted husband who had shown her that vulnerability was not weakness, but the truest form of strength. They walked together through gardens that had grown lusher over the years, past the rose arbor where Sebastian had first told her he loved her, past the bench where they sat on summer evenings reading poetry aloud, and she felt the accumulated weight of their happiness, how each day had added another layer to the foundation of their marriage until it had become something solid and unshakable, built not on obligation or arrangement, but on choice renewed daily, on forgiveness freely given and love courageously offered. That evening, after the children had been tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Sebastian and Arabella sat together in the drawing room where he had proposed to her for the second time, in the room that held so many memories of their journey from strangers to friends to lovers, and she leaned against his shoulder while he read Wordsworth aloud, his voice a familiar comfort, and when he paused, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression of such tenderness, it still had the power to steal her breath. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" he asked, setting the book aside and pulling her closer. "I think about that day you ran from our wedding, and I find myself grateful for it." She stirred in surprise, but he continued, his hand stroking her hair with absent affection. "If you had married me then, it would have been out of duty, out of obedience to our family's wishes, and we might have built a cordial enough life together, but we would never have truly known each other, never have chosen each other freely, and I would rather have endured all the pain and uncertainty and loneliness of those 3 years than have missed the gift of your real choice and your genuine love." Arabella felt tears prick her eyes as she reached up to cup his face, drawing him down for a kiss that tasted of gratitude and devotion and the kind of love that only deepened with time. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love the man you are, the father you've become, and the life we've built together from the ashes of what might have been a terrible mistake." They sat together in comfortable silence as the fire crackled, and outside the window the last light faded from the autumn sky, and she thought about how far they had traveled from that moment in the church when she had dropped her bouquet and run, how many small choices and brave conversations and vulnerable moments had been required to bring them to this place of peace and plenty and profound connection. Dear listener, perhaps you find yourself thinking about your own moments of fear, your own mistakes that seemed catastrophic at the time, your own failures to see beneath the surface of situations or people who frightened you, and I want you to know that our stories are rarely as simple as they first appear, that the choices we make from fear do not have to define us forever, and that grace exists in the possibility of trying again with clearer eyes and braver hearts. Arabella ran from a wedding and humiliated a man in front of society, and it seemed then like an ending, like a door slammed shut on any possibility of happiness, but it was actually a beginning and a necessary breaking apart that allowed for a truer coming together. And sometimes our mistakes lead us down paths we would never have chosen, but which bring us eventually to destinations far better than we could have planned. People are so rarely what they first appear to be. The cold Duke was actually a frightened man, armoring his tender heart. The cruel rumors were distortions of honorable actions. The entrapment was actually protection, offered from a distance by someone who loved without expectation of return. And if we can find the courage to look again, to ask questions, to offer second chances both to others and to ourselves, we may discover that what we feared was actually what we needed most. Love requires such courage, the willingness to be vulnerable after being hurt, to choose again after running away, to believe that people can change and grow and reveal depths we did not initially perceive, and that courage is worth cultivating, because the alternative, a life lived in safe isolation, protected from risk, but also from connection, is no life at all but merely existence. So if you are carrying the weight of mistakes made in fear, if you have run from something or someone because you believed untrue things, or because you were too frightened to stay and discover the truth, know that it is never too late to turn around, to extend the olive branch, to say, "I was wrong," or "Can we try again?" or simply, "I see you now in ways I could not see you before." And if you are the one who was left behind, who was hurt by someone else's fear or misunderstanding, consider whether there might be grace enough in your heart to forgive, to offer another chance, to recognize that we are all doing our best with the understanding we have at any given moment, and that transformation is always possible when we choose love over pride, vulnerability over self-protection, hope over cynicism. May you find the courage to look beneath surfaces, to question your assumptions, to offer and accept second chances, to build love not on obligation but on genuine choice renewed daily, And may you discover, as Arabella and Sebastian discovered, that our mistakes need not be endings but can become doorways to grace we could not have imagined, to love deeper and truer than any we had previously known, to lives transformed by the simple radical act of choosing each other freely and continuing to choose each other through all the days that follow. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with possibilities and second chances and the transformative power of love courageously offered and gratefully received. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to try again, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, healing, and the extraordinary grace that can emerge from our very human mistakes.